What if I told you that my life changed the moment I met my death? I was someone who believed I knew the truth, who was sure of my faith and purpose. I thought I understood everything. But one night, in the blink of an eye, everything turned upside down. I saw something I never imagined, something that shattered everything I had believed in. I experienced clinical death, and what I saw made me question everything about my faith. Are you ready to hear what I discovered? Even now, I can hardly believe what I went through. My name is Ahmed, and I was an Imam. For many years, I believed I had found my true purpose in life. I was certain of my faith, unwavering in the belief that every word of the Quran was absolute truth. I was born and raised in a Muslim family, and my entire life had been dedicated to serving Allah. My family and my community placed their trust and great expectations in me. I felt needed, important, as though I was fulfilling my duty not only to Allah but also to those around me. Every action I took was guided by a sense of responsibility, and I felt honored to carry the weight of my role as a spiritual leader. Over the years, my belief in the teachings of Islam grew stronger. I found comfort in the routine of prayers, in the community that surrounded me, and in the knowledge that I was doing what I believed was the will of Allah. My faith was my anchor, and it kept me grounded through the highs and lows of life. I found peace in knowing my purpose, to guide others, to teach the Quran, to help those in need, and to live a life devoted to serving my Creator. It was a life of certainty, a life where I felt a deep connection to something greater than myself. When I moved to America, everything seemed to fall into place. It was a new beginning for my family and me, a fresh chapter in our lives. We worked hard to establish ourselves in a new country, and I was determined to build a sense of community for Muslims who had relocated here. We started a mosque, a place that not only served as a sanctuary for prayer, but also as a refuge for those seeking belonging, peace, and safety in a foreign land. I believed this was part of Allah's grand plan, that everything was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. I had no doubts. My purpose had never felt clearer. In America, I felt a sense of fulfillment I had not known before. My role as an imam was more than just a title. It was a mission. I worked tirelessly to help immigrants navigate their new lives, always reminding them of the importance of faith in times of uncertainty. I took pride in the sense of community we had built, and I thought with complete certainty that my life had meaning, that my purpose was to serve others, and in doing so, serve Allah. But life, as it often does, took an unexpected turn. At 67 years old, I was given a diagnosis that shattered everything I thought I knew. The doctors told me I had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The words felt surreal, almost as though they didn't belong in my life. How could this happen to me? I had devoted my life to serving Allah, to living a righteous life. It seemed impossible. The doctors told me my time was limited and that the treatments offered had only a slim chance of extending my life. The truth hit me with a force that left me breathless. I was left with a sense of uncertainty that I had never known before. For the first time in my life, I found myself asking questions I had never dared to ask. I struggled with the reality of the diagnosis. The sense of invincibility I had once felt slowly began to crumble. I had always believed that faith and devotion would keep me safe, that my purpose had already been determined by Allah. But now I was faced with something I couldn't control. The cancer, the treatments, the looming uncertainty about my future. It all shook me to my core. I prayed harder than ever before, asking Allah for strength, for guidance, for a sign. But I couldn't escape the feeling that my life, the life I had built with so much faith and conviction, was slipping away from me. I didn't know what the future held anymore. Everything I thought I understood about my purpose, my role, my beliefs, it was all being questioned in a way I had never anticipated. This diagnosis, this terrifying reality, marked the beginning of a journey that would take me far beyond the boundaries of my understanding, far beyond the life I had known. What followed would challenge everything I thought I knew about faith, about life, and about myself. When the doctors told me I had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, my world came crashing down. I felt as though the very foundation of my beliefs was beginning to crack. All my life, I had believed that every trial I faced was part of Allah's will, that illness was a test of faith, of strength, of my dedication to Him. I had always been taught that enduring hardship was a path to spiritual growth, and that it was through these trials that we proved our devotion to Allah. But now, as I sat in the sterile hospital room listening to the doctor's words, I couldn't help but question everything I had ever known. The reality of my diagnosis was hard to grasp. Stage 4, terminal. My time was limited, and the treatments offered to me were nothing more than a small chance to prolong the inevitable. As I began the rounds of chemotherapy, I tried to hold on to my faith, repeating the prayers I had said countless times before. Each session of treatment felt like another test, another trial. But the more I endured, the more questions crept into my mind. What if this wasn't just a test? What if my entire understanding of Allah's will had been wrong? What if this suffering wasn't a divine trial, but something else? Something I couldn't understand? Each day in the hospital, as I lay in bed hooked up to machines and feeling the effects of the chemo coursing through my body, I began to struggle with doubts I had never before allowed myself to entertain. I had always believed that my faith would protect me, that my service to Allah would shield me from pain and suffering. But now, here I was, suffering in a way I had never imagined. I prayed harder than ever, desperately asking for strength, for healing, for guidance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I was seeking weren't coming. I continued to hold on to my role as an Imam, believing that my mission had meaning, that my service to the community and my devotion to Allah would help me through this trial. But with each passing day, I felt the weight of my faith begin to buckle under the pressure of my illness. At night, when I lay in that cold hospital bed, I would pray, hoping that Allah would hear me, that I would find peace in my suffering. But the peace never came. There were no answers, no comfort, only silence. I had always been so certain of my purpose, so confident in the path I had chosen. But now, as I faced the reality of my diagnosis, I couldn't help but wonder if I had misunderstood everything. Was this really a test, or was it something else? Was there more to my suffering than I had ever allowed myself to consider? I felt lost, confused, and more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. And then, one evening, everything changed. I was lying in my bed as I had done countless times before. But this time was different. The air felt heavy, thick with uncertainty. I closed my eyes, desperate for some kind of answer, some reassurance that my suffering had a purpose. But instead of finding peace, I was suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of darkness. It wasn't the darkness of sleep, but something much deeper, something more foreboding. I felt as if I were being pulled away from everything I had ever known, from the life I had lived, and I began to wonder if this was it, if this was the end. I didn't understand what was happening to me, but I knew in that moment that my life, my faith, and my understanding of the world were all about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I felt a sense of urgency in the air, like something greater was waiting to be revealed, something I wasn't prepared for. And as the darkness around me grew deeper, I realized that the questions I'd been carrying with me for so long were about to be answered, but not in the way I had expected. That night, lying in my hospital bed, I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something immense and unknowable. And I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had believed in, everything I had worked for, was on the verge of being shattered. One evening, after a particularly grueling chemotherapy session, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a spasm, something I could brush off, but the pain quickly intensified. Within moments, I could hardly breathe. Doctors and nurses scrambled around me, trying to revive me, but all I could do was watch as they worked desperately. I felt my body growing colder, as if I was slipping away from it. My heart had stopped, and I realized that I was no longer in my body, but outside it, detached from everything I knew. I hovered above the scene, fully aware, despite the lifeless state of my body below. It felt surreal, almost like a dream, but the clarity of my thoughts made it impossible to ignore the truth. I was experiencing death. I knew that my time was near, but I couldn't comprehend what was happening. It was as if I was in a place between worlds, uncertain whether I was moving toward an end or a beginning. Just as I was trying to understand what was unfolding, I saw a light in the distance. The light was warm, inviting, and filled with a sense of peace that was unlike anything I had ever felt. It drew me toward it, and I found myself moving closer, almost instinctively, as if I had no control over my own motion. The closer I got, the more familiar sounds surrounded me. I could hear the soft lullabies my mother used to sing, the evening prayers my father had recited, and the faint echoes of Quranic verses I had heard so many times throughout my life. It was as though my entire existence, every memory I had, was converging in that moment. I felt a sense of comfort, of total connection to everything that had ever mattered to me. In that light, I thought, this must be paradise. The peace I felt was overwhelming, unlike anything I had ever experienced on earth. It wasn't the peace of a quiet room or a calm moment. It was the peace of a soul at rest, a peace that washed over me and embraced me completely. I was not crying from pain, but from sheer joy. It was as if the worries of my entire life had been lifted from my heart, and I was free from all suffering. Tears flowed down my face, not from sadness, but from the purity of the joy I felt, the kind of joy I had never known before. But then, just as quickly as the peace had enveloped me, it began to shift. The lush surroundings around me began to wither, and the vibrant colors faded into darkness. The trees I had seen were losing their leaves, their once green branches turning black and brittle. The beautiful fruit that had hung from them shriveled and decayed before my eyes, and the pleasant warmth of the light started to dissipate, replaced by a chill. A foul stench filled the air, a smell of rot and decay, unlike anything I had ever encountered. The world around me, once so inviting, now felt cold and hostile. The light that had felt so comforting now seemed distant and unreachable as darkness closed in around me. I could hear cries in the distance, men, women, and children, screaming out in anguish. It wasn't just noise. It was a collective pain, a sorrow so intense that it seemed to pierce my very soul. Among these cries, one stood out above the rest. It was my mother's voice calling out, "Have mercy, have mercy." Her words tore at my heart, and I felt an unbearable weight pressing down on me, as though the very air around me was suffocating me. The darkness grew heavier, and I began to feel trapped in a void, unable to discern up from down. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. I was overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness that I had never known before. Just when I thought I could endure no more, a deep, resonant voice broke through the silence. It wasn't like any voice I had ever heard before. It was ancient, powerful, and unyielding. "Ahmed," the voice said, and everything seemed to stop. "Everything will now be revealed." At the sound of my name, I felt a shiver run through me, and I saw something in the distance, a figure sitting on a throne. As I moved toward it, my knees buckled, and I collapsed to the ground. It was a figure I recognized immediately, a figure that should have brought me comfort, but instead, it filled me with confusion and fear. It was the Prophet Muhammad, but something was wrong. His hands were bound in chains, and his face was filled with sorrow. The sight of him, a figure I had revered and looked up to my entire life, in such a state of despair, shattered something deep inside me. This wasn't the paradise I had imagined. I tried to scream, to understand, but my voice was swallowed by the void. I was drowning in this darkness, surrounded by questions that I had no answers to. What was this place? Why was the prophet bound? Why was I here? The answers I sought remained out of reach, and the weight of everything I had believed in suddenly felt like it was crumbling around me. Then something happened that I couldn't explain. The world around me began to change in ways that filled me with confusion and fear. The greenery that had surrounded me started to blacken, the trees losing their leaves, the vibrant fruit withering away. The air grew heavy with a foul stench, the smell of decay and rot. I felt the darkness creeping in, slowly but steadily, smothering me. The peace I had once felt was now a distant memory, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I could hear strange, distant cries, and amidst them, one voice stood out above the rest. My mother's voice crying out, "Please have mercy on me." Her voice was filled with such anguish, it pierced through me like a knife, and I felt the weight of it deep in my chest. The darkness around me grew thicker, more oppressive, as though it were pulling me down into an abyss I couldn't escape. In that moment, I felt as though I were trapped, unable to breathe, unable to move. The sense of being lost, of being consumed by the very darkness I had once believed I was meant to transcend, was suffocating. I could not see anything clearly, but I felt it. A deep, gnawing fear that I was being swallowed by something beyond my control. I struggled to understand what was happening, but the more I tried to comprehend it, the more the darkness seemed to tighten its grip. I was no longer sure if I was alive or dead, and the distinction between the two began to blur. Suddenly, my gaze fell upon a figure in the distance, sitting upon a throne. The figure was one I recognized instantly. It was the Prophet Muhammad. But something was horribly wrong. His hands were bound in chains, his face filled with sorrow and despair. This was not the image I had always held in my heart. The Prophet, revered and respected in my faith, was now bound, shackled, and mournful. I couldn't understand it. Why was he here? Why was he in chains? It was as though everything I had known, everything I had believed in, was being turned upside down. This image of the Prophet, broken and suffering, shattered the very foundation of my faith. I cried out in confusion, but my voice was swallowed by the abyss that surrounded me. It was as though the very air itself rejected my words. And then, a deep, resonant voice broke through the silence. It was not the voice of the Prophet, but a voice far older, far more powerful. It spoke my name. "Ahmed, now everything will be revealed to you." The words rang in my ears, and in the next moment, something appeared before me. A book. It was the Quran. The pages began to turn on their own, as though some invisible hand was flipping them, guiding them with an intent I could not understand. The voice spoke again, this time with an intensity that made my entire being tremble. "Who is Allah, Ahmed? Have you ever truly asked yourself that question?" The question struck me like a lightning bolt, shocking me to my core. I had never asked myself that question before. I had always accepted Allah's nature as unquestionable, as absolute truth, something beyond any doubt. But now, in the midst of this strange and terrifying experience, I realized that I had never truly questioned the nature of my faith. How could I have not? How had I lived my life so convinced of something without truly understanding it? The voice pressed on, digging deeper into the very heart of my beliefs, unraveling everything I thought I knew. As the pages of the Quran continued to turn, Images began to rise from them, images of history, of ancient times. I saw the Kaaba, but it was different. It was surrounded by idols, people offering sacrifices to gods I had never been taught about. The voice continued. Where was Allah among these gods, Ahmed? Before Islam, the Arabs worshipped Allah as one God among many. Have you ever thought about that? The realization hit me with the force of a wave crashing against a rock. My understanding of Allah, my understanding of the Quran, everything I had been taught, was suddenly being called into question. I had believed that Allah was the one true God, the creator of all things. But now I was being shown a different story, a story that made me question the very foundation of my beliefs. Was my faith built on a lie? Had I been deceived? I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the weight of these revelations overwhelmed me. My mind reeled with confusion and disbelief. This was too much to bear, too much to process. The life I had built, the faith I had placed my trust in, was now unraveling before my eyes. The darkness around me seemed to press in even harder, suffocating me. I was trapped in my own confusion, unable to escape the flood of doubts that had now taken root in my heart. I whispered to myself, have I been deceived? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The words echoed in my mind, over and over again. Who is Allah, Ahmed? Have you ever truly asked yourself that question? I couldn't escape them. They were like a wound in my soul, a deep cut that I could not ignore. How had I never questioned the very nature of Allah, the very foundation of my belief? How had I, as an Imam, devoted my life to teaching others, yet never allowed myself to ask such a simple yet profound question? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply I had been immersed in a faith I had never truly understood, a faith I had accepted without truly examining its roots. Images began to emerge from the pages of the Quran, each one more disturbing than the last. I saw scenes of the past before Islam, the Kaaba, the sacred house of Allah, surrounded by idols. People offering sacrifices to these idols, praying to gods I had never even been taught about. It was as if the very foundation of Islam, of my faith, was being ripped apart before my eyes. The Kaaba, which I had always seen as the center of all devotion, was now just one among many shrines, one among many objects of worship. I had always believed that Allah was the one true God, but now in the vision that was unfolding before me, I saw that Allah was once just one deity among many. This realization struck me like a hammer to the chest. How had I never known this? How had I never questioned the fact that before Islam, the Arabs worshipped Allah along with other gods? My mind was reeling, spinning in confusion. This was not what I had been taught, not what I had believed all my life. But there it was, laid bare in front of me, a history I had never truly known, a history I had been blind to. And then, just as I was beginning to process the enormity of what I'd seen, another image appeared. A giant idol, towering over the landscape with the name Baal inscribed upon it. I recognized the name, but the connection was too overwhelming for me to understand at first. Baal, an ancient god of the Canaanites, and now I saw that there was a connection between this idol and Allah. The realization hit me with such force that it felt like the ground was slipping out from beneath me. This was the moment when the truth truly began to unfold. I had been deceived. I had spent my life worshiping and teaching something that was built on a foundation of error. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My entire world, everything I had devoted myself to, was crashing down around me. The panic was overwhelming. I had been a fool. I had been blinded by what I thought was the truth, by the teachings I had accepted without ever questioning them. I had spent years of my life devoted to a faith that I now saw was built on misunderstandings, half-truths, and lies. I had been deceived. How could I have been so blind? How had I not seen the connections, the contradictions, the historical distortions that had shaped my faith? As the images continued to flood my mind, I was consumed by a sense of betrayal, not from others, but from myself. How had I let this happen? How had I spent my life leading others without ever truly understanding what I was teaching? My sense of self, my entire identity as an imam, as a servant of Allah, was crumbling before me. The foundation I had built my life upon had been shattered, and I was left standing in the ruins, unsure of what to believe, unsure of who I was anymore. The darkness around me seemed to deepen as these realizations settled into my soul. I had always believed that my faith was the path to truth, the path to peace. But now, everything I had thought I knew was being questioned, turned upside down. I had always trusted in the teachings I had received, in the words I had passed on to others. But now, those very words felt hollow, empty, meaningless. I had devoted myself to a cause I now saw as flawed, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered beliefs. The truth was terrifying, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I was free from the chains of unquestioning belief. I could no longer cling to the certainty I had once had. Instead, I was faced with the uncomfortable truth that I had to find my own path, my own understanding of the world, of faith, and of God. The journey I had thought was behind me had only just begun. When I opened my eyes in the hospital room, I immediately felt that I was no longer the person I once was. Everything had changed. My mind was reeling from the revelations I had experienced, and I couldn't find my place in the world anymore. The person I had been, the Imam who had stood confidently at the front of the congregation, preaching the words I believed to be the truth, now seemed like a stranger to me. I felt as though my very foundation had been shattered. Everything I had taught others, everything I had believed in, now seemed uncertain, dubious, and unconvincing. I couldn't trust the faith that had once been my anchor. In the weeks that followed, I found myself consumed by doubt. I couldn't stop questioning everything. I began reading books that were forbidden to me before, books that challenged my previous understanding. I studied different philosophies, other religious texts, and the history of the world with a fresh perspective. Each page I turned felt like an attempt to fill the void in my heart, a heart that was now searching for the truth I had been so sure of and yet had somehow lost. But where was it? What was the truth? And how could I know it? These questions tormented me. My doubts grew deeper with every passing day. It was as though I had been walking a path for so long, only to realize that the road I'd been on led to nowhere. I was lost, wandering, looking for something that would make sense of everything. I questioned my own experiences, my own understanding, and the teachings I had shared with others. I felt utterly alone in my journey. The more I searched for answers, the more I realized how much I didn't know. I couldn't find peace within the faith I had followed for so many years. But one day, I met a priest who, for some reason, seemed to exude a calmness and understanding I hadn't encountered before. He spoke gently to me, and I felt an unusual sense of comfort in his presence. He said to me, "Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life." Those words pierced me in a way I hadn't anticipated. They resonated deep within me, in the very core of my being. I had heard those words before, of course, but never had they felt so real, so relevant to my own struggle. For the first time, I thought there might be more to the story of faith than I had ever known. I began to realize that my search for the truth was not meant to be confined to the teachings I had always known. There was a deeper truth out there, one that I had yet to discover. It wasn't an easy decision. The journey I was about to embark on was not going to be simple, nor would it be without its struggles. I had spent my entire life as an imam, as a leader in my community, and turning away from that path felt like a betrayal of everything I had worked for. But as I sat there, listening to the priest speak, I felt a quiet peace settle in my heart. It was not a peace that came from certainty, but rather from a sense of release, as though I was letting go of a burden I had been carrying without fully realizing its weight. I no longer had all the answers, but I realized that this journey, the one I had started when I questioned my faith, was leading me somewhere new. It was leading me to a deeper understanding of who I was and what I truly believed. I was no longer an imam. I had walked away from that life, and though it was a difficult decision, it was a necessary one. In doing so, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't have to hold on to the identity of the imam anymore. I didn't need to continue living a life that no longer aligned with what I had come to understand. I found a new truth, a new path, one that was open and full of light. The journey I was on wasn't over, but it had just begun. I had found something new, something that gave me peace despite my doubts. The search for truth was ongoing, but I no longer felt lost. I felt a sense of clarity that had eluded me for so long. I knew that I was now on the right path, and though it wasn't easy, I was ready to follow it, wherever it might lead.